Let's go right to MS Now's legal affairs reporter, Fallon Gallagher at the Supreme Court. Also with us, MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin, MS Now legal analyst Catherine Christian, and Duncan Levin, a former federal prosecutor. Fallon, give us a recap here. What did the court say?
Yeah, Anna, this is a massive blow for the president's agenda, tariffs, of course, being one of his signature policies, and the Supreme Court saying that the president cannot use IEEPA to unilaterally impose these tariffs. Now, of course, the tariffs at question in this case came from 5 different executive orders targeting a number of countries, but the Supreme Court is saying that the president does not have the authority to do this. Now, the vote breakdown here was 6-3, with Justice Roberts writing the majority opinion. That's not surprising. Typically, the Chief Justice will reserve that majority opinion in the trickiest of cases for himself, and Justice Thomas leading in the dissents. But what's really notable here is that there are 7 written opinions. That's because a number of justices wrote the majority, concurrences, and various dissents. The only 2 justices who didn't write separate opinions were Justices Alito and Justice Sotomayor. Now, the key difference here in between these opinions and the various concurrences and why they believed the president doesn't have this authority mostly relies on the major questions doctrine. Now, that means that the Congress has to explicitly give the president authority to do certain things, and the Supreme Court here finding that Congress has not given the president the authority to unilaterally impose tariffs, that is instead a taxation power that reserved for Congress. Most notably, though, in the dissent, Justice Thomas seems to argue that the major questions doctrine does not apply here, that the president should be able to unilaterally impose tariffs without any sort of limitation. The other big thing in this opinion is the question of refunds. Now, this is a question that had come up in oral arguments. Justice Barrett hinted at it about how difficult this might be in a practical sense. This opinion does not appear to really lay out a specific mechanism for how practically these refunds can happen. In fact, the only place where I've seen the mention of refunds so far is in Kavanaugh's dissent, where he points out how difficult this is going to be from a practical standpoint. And I want to remind you that while this litigation has been ongoing, those tariffs have been allowed to remain in effect. And that could be one of the reasons why the Supreme Court took this case up so quickly, moving it from the emergency docket to the merits document, hearing arguments rather quickly, and ruling rather early in the term, because the longer this goes on, the higher that amount is going to become. And I believe Secretary Bessent had estimated that by June, when the Supreme Court typically issues decisions, that amount could be $1 trillion. So the earlier opinion is going to be critical here. And I know we've been talking for weeks, when is this going to come? When is this going to come? I've stood outside court on a number of days where we didn't get this opinion. This is relatively early considering how complex this is. I cannot tell you a time in recent memory where I've seen 7 written opinions from these justices. Anna?
Fallon, great job breaking it down for us. Thank you for bringing us that reporting. Lisa, it sounds like a complicated decision. As she points out, 7 different decisions here, although, again, it was 6-3 when it came to the bottom line, and that is overruling the president's tariffs, those sweeping tariffs that he had invoked the Emergency Powers Act to invoke. Can you talk to me about, we all sat here, of course, on the day of the oral arguments. Based on what you're reading, are there any surprises yet?
There are not a ton of surprises. I think one surprise for me is just the court's failure to address the pragmatics, which was clearly weighing on the minds of some of the justices at oral argument. Amy Coney Barrett, as someone mentioned earlier, was very focused on, well, if you do this, how do you untangle the results for small business owners, for the American consumers, et cetera? And she seemed to be very focused on that. And yet, Justice Barrett not only doesn't write on her own behalf here, but the court as a whole isn't answering that question. I want to read to you, Fallon referred to it a few moments ago, from Justice Kavanaugh's dissent, where he really takes the majority to task for its failure to wrestle with some of the really complicated fallout from this. He says, the court's decision is likely to generate other serious practical consequences in the near term. One issue will be refunds. Refunds of billions of dollars would have significant consequences for the U.S. Treasury. The court says nothing today about whether, and if so, how the government should go about returning the billions of dollars that it has collected from importers. But that process is likely to be a, quote, mess, end quote, as was acknowledged at oral argument. And then he goes on to talk about another practical problem here. A second issue is the decision's effect on the current trade deals, meaning the trade deals that the administration has struck all around the world. He says because IEEPA, and that's the statute here that the president was relying relying on, tariffs have helped facilitate trade deals worth trillions of dollars, including with foreign nations from China to the United Kingdom to Japan. The court's decision could generate uncertainty regarding various trade agreements. That process, too, could be difficult. And that, of course, is understatement from Justice Kavanaugh in that moment. Those two problems, as well as the question of whether the president will now try to justify tariffs under a variety of different other statutory options. Justice Kavanaugh counts 5 in his dissent. Those are going to be sort of the practical fallout from this decision that policymakers, as well as business owners and consumers all over this country, are going to be dealing with in the coming weeks and months. And of course, the court is silent as to those things. It may not think it was its role to decide them, but its failure to offer any clarity about what should happen is one of the things that's going to be most challenging in the wake of this opinion, Anna.
Yeah, so how do those next steps work?
It's not shocking to me when a court says, you can't do this, but they don't tell you. It's basically, now you figure out how you're supposed to do it the right way. That's not shocking to me. They don't want to get involved in policy. This came up in oral argument. In fact, it was Justice Barrett who made a point, and she's with the majority today saying the president cannot unilaterally impose tariffs. So it's not shocking to me. There appears to be, and I agree, Senator Warren is quoted as, there appears to be no legal mechanism to get the money back, the people who, to recoup the tariffs that were already paid. So, you know, that's just going to be out there. I guess for the people who had to pay tariffs, at least they won't have to pay anymore unless the administration comes with another way to do it. And I guarantee you that will end up back in the Supreme Court, too, if it's done unlawfully.
And just kind of closing the loop on a question I asked very early on, when it goes back to the lower courts, what's their role at this point?
Well, this I misstated before. It's just sent back to the lower court to dismiss it finally. So it says remanded back to the district court to dismiss because of lack of jurisdiction. So that this particular case is over, but it might come back in a different form.
Duncan, what does this ruling signal about the court's independence from President Trump? And does John Roberts now become Trump's latest foe?
Well, he may become President Trump's latest foe, but I actually don't think this decision has much to say at all about President Trump in particular. It really, for anyone who's been dealing with some of these issues with IEEPA, and I know the American public is just coming to learn the words IEEPA and what it is, the statute itself has a long history that precedes it from the early 1910s when presidents were given this power to regulate trading with the enemy. There's this act called the Trading with the Enemy Act. And the power was expanded in the 1930s to allow presidents to regulate trading with the enemies during national emergencies. The president at that time, FDR, who was dealing with the Great Depression, used it as a way to regulate some finances with gold and other national emergencies. And over time, it came to be used by presidents to regulate all sorts of trading emergencies, national emergencies. And when Watergate came around in the 1970s, Congress actually passed IEEPA, this International Emergency Economic Powers Act, as a way to take power away from the presidency, not to give the president more power. And so as a way of doing that, they said you can declare national emergencies and use it, for example, to block property and freeze assets, prohibit transfers. It's been used by presidents for all sorts of things like freezing Iranian assets, sanctioning Russian oligarchs, restricting North Korean trade. But the guardrails that Congress put on it in the 1970s were meant to take power away from the presidency. So really, this is not about President Trump. It's not about President Nixon. It's really about separation of powers. And I don't think that there's any kind of animus here from the Supreme Court. This is really looking at the statute, the history of the way it was used. And it's the Supreme Court's way of saying what this power that was granted to the presidency through IEEPA wasn't broad enough to include taxation. The words taxation don't appear in it. The words, block and nullify and prohibit, those are words that appear in IEEPA. Those are coercive tools that are aimed at foreign actors. And the difference is not just semantic, it's a constitutional difference.
It may not be a direct message to the president. However, this is his signature policy. And Lisa, some of the justices this president handpicked ruled against him.
Yeah, but that happens across presidencies. If you take sort of a broader historical view, This president likes to believe that his justices should be working for him. But that is not a view that bears itself out over the course of history by and large. You see justices disappoint the presidents that nominated them all the time. I think David Souter is a great example of somebody who was pitched as a classic conservative when he was nominated and yet turned out to be very different on the bench. So, yes, the president may take this to be some form of betrayal by those that he nominated to the court, and yet I don't think this will be the first or the last time that some of these folks are going to disappoint him in that regard. Anna, I want to go back to your question, if I can, about what was surprising here, because there's another nugget of a surprise of sorts in Justice Gorsuch's concurrence. There is a paragraph that he wrote that sounds almost as if he's writing a message to the American people about the importance of Congress and the legislative process, something we don't talk a lot about right now because Congress isn't actually doing much legislating at all. And he writes that most major decisions affecting the rights and responsibilities of the American people, including the duty to pay taxes and tariffs, are funneled through the legislative process for a reason. Yes, legislating can be hard and take time. And yes, it can be tempting to bypass Congress when some pressing problem arises. But the deliberative nature of the legislative process was the whole point of its design. Through that process, the nation can tap the combined wisdom of the people's elected representatives, not just that of one faction or man. And he goes on. But that, to me, strikes me as Gorsuch basically saying to Congress, hey, guys, you have a job to do, and you maybe should remember how to do it, but also telling the American people it's not normal for most policy decisions to be made from the White House, from Pennsylvania Avenue. The whole structure of our constitutional system was predicated on Congress being the policy actors, and you should take them and their responsibilities seriously. You should hold them to that as well.